The process of separation is now complete. To recombine our ingredients, we must bring into our awareness the grammar of each part. In the last episode of All Aboard, we began our journey with a man named Charles Loring Brace. We brought forth the first constituent part of what will be joined into the Citronitis, the shaking of faith. Having lost a good friend and his dear sister, Brace resolved to, quote, dread not to meet sorrow, only to become purified by it, end quote. He emerged from his sorrow a newly formed creature with a mission to accomplish. To begin this mission, the Hartford boys took a leisurely stroll through Ireland to acquire just a dash of the famine at the time. A proposition was made to Charles early in this spring to break away from familiar scenes for a few months and start on a walking trip in England, Ireland, and the Rhine country with his friends John and Frederick Olmsted. He entered the plan with his usual enthusiasm, and they sailed in May, end quote. This was May 1850, the summer immediately following his sister's untimely passing. Neither Emma, his daughter, nor Charles Brace felt it important to inform us who made this quote-unquote proposition to Charles and the Olmsted boys. And this will become a recurring theme as we trace Charles Loring Brace's footsteps through his seemingly charmed life. A man of philanthropy and nothing more, of course. He was even described as a quote-unquote mugwump, a word culturally appropriated from the Algonquin tribe meaning important person or kingpin. This was a group of early Republican Party activists who famously claimed to have swung the 1884 presidential election by switching parties and supporting the Democrat Grover Cleveland. Whether this be true or not, the final image and a higher moral authority is what Charles Loring Brace would constantly strive to keep at the forefront of his public persona. As we get further into All Aboard, I hope it becomes as apparent to you as it is to me why the notion of Charles Loring Brace being a person of true character opposing political corruption and looking out for the best interests of poor quote-unquote orphans is truly hilarious and deserving of a further investigation. Take this excerpt from the book, The Enduring Vision, A History of American People, Volume 2. In 1843, Robert M. Hartley founded the New York Association for Improving the Condition of Poor to help poor families. Hartley's voluntaristic approach was supplemented by the more coercive tactics of Charles Loring Brace, who founded the New York Children's Aid Society in 1853. Worried that they might join the city's quote-unquote dangerous classes, Brace swept orphan children off the streets, shipped them to the country, and placed them with families to work as farmhands, end quote. In my opinion, this is an honest account of who Charles Loring Brace was. Quote-unquote coercive is probably the most accurate way to describe his tactics of procuring Irish and German children off the streets of New York City. Before we dig up all the dirt, let's follow the Hartford boys on their journey through Europe. They begin in Ireland at the tail end of the Irish potato famine, an extremely relevant event we will thoroughly unpack in future episodes. In Ireland, the Hartford boys received a letter of introduction from another anonymous person to yet another influential figure of the time, Mr. Robert Neill of Belfast, the future father-in-law of Charles Loring Brace. The three boys aren't the only influential Americans Mr. Neill would, quote, welcome with Irish hospitality. Quote, he was an ardent anti-slavery man, and numbered amongst his American friends were the likes of William Lloyd Garrison, Henry C. Wright, and Frederick Douglass, who have all been guests, end quote. All very prominent figures during a very important time of change in our country. Beyond meddling with the political figures of our country, Neill had a very active political career in his own country of Ireland. Quote, from 1830 until 1853, his name appears regularly in the columns of the Belfast newsletter as the advocate of radical progressive causes, to many of which he pledged his quote-unquote own money, end quote. Many of these causes aligned with political positions Brace would take when he returns to the States. For instance, Neill sat on the Belfast Anti-Slavery Committee. We have formerly covered Brace's opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act. Parliamentary reform, which Brace would champion half-heartedly but full-throatedly his entire life in America. Neill would also be involved in finding relief for victims of the Irish potato famine, another fortunate event for Brace to flex his own philanthropic muscle. During his best work, after the Irish families had already been starved or priced out of their land and survived a ride on the coffin ships to either New York City or Canada. Another thing I find intriguing about Mr. Neill's political activism is towards the end. Only after Charles Loring Brace and the boys visit in the summer of 1850 does Robert Neill start, quote, protesting against papal aggression, something Neill was against in his former years. In 1837, he resolved that the catechism still be allowed in poorhouses, putting it on equal footing with Presbyterianism. Yet another intriguing feature of the boys' mysterious first stop is Mr. Neill's religious philosophy, Unitarianism. On the surface, this seems innocent enough, but with a little extra context, I begin to think differently about these quote-unquote progressives. Much like the quote-unquote progressives of 2025, their only job in society, in my opinion, is to be the quote-unquote KO of order ab chaos, something we've covered on previous episodes. The most concise way to describe the philosophy is that, quote, concerns of Unitarians are humanist rather than theological. Just a fanciful, dare I say, rhetorical way of saying Unitarianism is the perfect religion for people who don't believe in God. This was during a time when the materialistic, evolutionary, might is right attitude hadn't quite taken hold. But the frog had been boiling in this pot for several years already. Unitarianism directly refuted Trinity, original sin, and more specifically, the ecumenical councils, basically the idea of Christianity and Catholicism as a whole. The founder of the Unitarian movement, Joseph Priestley, called it, quote, primitive Christianity before later corruption set in. Again, when one doesn't have the correct grammar for the situation, this can sound like a great thing, but when the grammar is found to define the situation more accurately, we will often find many other neglected aspects to the quote-unquote logical conclusions. Another thing that should be noted about the founder of the Unitarianism movement is that he was part of a group named the Lunar Society of Birmingham, a British dinner club that met regularly between 1865 and 1813. Claimed to have always been an informal group, it supposedly never had a constitution or kept minutes of any of its meetings. Made up of other learned men, this group was founded by even more interesting characters than it produced. In addition to Joseph Priestley, one of the men being Samuel Galton Jr., the paternal grandfather of Francis Galton, and the other man being Erasmus Darwin. Not only was Darwin once so fat he was said to have modified his dinner table to fit his belly, but he was also the maternal grandfather of both Francis Galton and Charles Darwin. Yes, they are cousins. Probably kissing cousins if you ask me. Another reason I find this meeting of the minds so fascinating is because during the time of the meeting, one of the most common places for these men to meet was the home of Erasmus Darwin in Litchfield, Connecticut, the birthplace and childhood home of our very protagonist, Charles Loring Brace. After Brace and the boys get radicalized by his future father-in-law, they take the next leg of their epic trip and make their way to Germany, a place Charles Loring Brace finds most agreeable, so much so that in the wintertime his friends end up making the journey back to New York City and leave Charles behind to quote-unquote study theology. In my opinion, this is the exact point where Charles Brace's life gets very interesting. Until now, he's just your average Yale graduate. As the quote, consequences of his father's watchful attention to his development, he was ready for college at 14 and lingered outside until 16. He was all his life a good linguist, end quote. Which I find hilarious because in my opinion, his books are not well written and hard to get through. But I digress. Admittedly, I go pretty hard on the little fella because I truly believe he was either a master manipulator or the biggest useful idiot of his time. I'll let you come to your own conclusions on which as we continue our journey in All Aboard. With this section, I will reveal where much of my bias about Charles Loring Brace comes from, and why I believe he was fully aware of his part in erasing his story of not only the Irish Catholic population that he so despised, but also the population of the American Republic. Through my research of this time period, I have come to understand the concept of the American melting pot in a whole new way. In 1863, just 4 years after Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species at the height of the American Civil War, Brace published another work called The Races of the Old World. It's a difficult read, in my opinion. Author Randall Fuller, in his own pleasant and informative work, The Book That Changed America, describes Brace's work as, quote, a sprawling, ramshackle work he modeled on The Origin of Species. Like Darwin's work, the book is a compendium of miscellaneous facts gathered from a wide range of fields. Unlike Darwin's work, it is deeply marred by a series of internal contradictions, end quote. In other words, logic was nowhere to be found. I'd say this is an accurate, maybe even generous description of Races of the Old World. Fuller goes on in chapter 20 to describe the work more thoroughly, stating, it also exposed a troubling fact. Linguists did nothing to suggest that human history was progressive. Instead, it chronicled a series of mass migrations and endless cycles of conflicts and conquest, dislocations and intermixtures. All too often, Brace's catalog of invasions and intermingling signaled the decline of culture, end quote. This seems impossible to have been lost on Brace at the time of his writing, as evidenced by page 9 in the introduction of Races of the Old World. Quote, small bodies of men may be indeed transported or forcibly expelled to other countries until they or their descendants lost their language, as the African slaves in this country or the Negroes of the West Indies, end quote. Given all the extra context we've been able to provide since this paragraph back in 1863, this becomes a very interesting quote. Charles Loring Brace not only studied and understood the most fundamental elements of completely erasing a civilization's history, he also understood the exact mechanisms by which you could achieve that goal. You must first erase their language. You can't just let these little heathens run amok and wreak havoc in whatever place they've been recently redistributed. You must replace their old grammar with a new grammar. And while in Germany, Brace found exactly what grammar he would teach all the little boys and girls he was about to put on the trains and ship out west. That language was to be Prussian. To close out today, we'll discuss another interesting letter he sends to his close Yale comrade, Frederick J. Kingsbury, on March 2nd, 1851, a letter in which Brace felt Kingsbury had, quote, given him unlimited carte blanche to write about his quote-unquote abstract self, end quote. At the beginning is all about how his faith is still shaky and he can't seem to, quote, fasten himself anywhere, end quote. And he makes a prediction to Fred that, in, quote, in a few years there may be a great reform movements in our sect which you would like to help on, in which you could not so easily if you decidedly left that church. End quote. Which is interesting in itself, but given the trajectory Brace's life is about to take, it makes me raise my eyebrows. Charles's letter to Frederick Kingsbury are always different from his letters to anyone else, indulging things I don't think any of the figures could have guessed would come under such close scrutiny over 150 years later. A perfect example is his mention of Harvard professor he met while in Germany, Francis J. Child, who at the time was studying at the place that will become very relevant later, the University of Göttingen, and a place many of our future characters will go to study at some point. But on top of all that, what I find most interesting about this letter to his friend Frederick J. Kingsbury are these few sentences sandwiched between everything and completely irrelevant, unless you know what you're looking for. Also found on page 119 of The Life of Charles Loring Brace, which the number 119 may or may not mean anything to you, but at any rate, quote, "My winter here in Berlin is drawing to its close. In fact, it's over in everything but cold and snow. We had our first snow March 3rd. End quote. You had your first snow on March 3rd, or 33, depending on how tight your tinfoil hat is, at the end of winter. Okay, anyways, moving on. I am convinced I did the wisest in coming here. I have studied Prussian manners very thoroughly and have unexampled advantages. Probably no diplomat in the city has had more." End quote. He's referring to New York City. So if extrapolated, this could mean Charles Loring Brace at one point during the 1850s may have been the most educated man on the subject of Prussian education. And if you don't know what the Prussian schooling system is, buckle up, Betty, because you're in for a wild ride. This will likely be a staple quote for the rest of the All Aboard series, and with each episode, it will become more apparent why. I'll state it now. Charles Loring Brace is only the tip of the iceberg. He's an overlooked character who was at one point very influential. He alone is responsible for the forced displacement of nearly 250,000 children. But he wasn't the only one. Boston, Philadelphia, and New York City all had programs to remove quote-unquote vagrant children from the inner city and place them as indentured servants in homes throughout the American Midwest. Who could even guess at what the real numbers are? Not to mention, at the very same time period, just a couple of hundred miles to the north, the Jesuit and Catholic Church were erasing the language, or grammar, from the indigenous population, all in the name of philanthropy. That's all we have time for today, though. Join me next time for more talk about Germany and Prussian connections. And we'll explore how Brace's best friend John Hull Olmsted will, quote, cast his die for the journey to his arrest in Hungary in search of a new utopia. Thank you for all your support. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Visit us on X at TL Productions 33 for extra content, and check out my newly constructed law library, something I intend to remain a free resource for all living men interested in their rights and sovereignty. With 352 individual thoughts already created and a resource I add to on a weekly basis, my goal is to make it one of the most effective tools of intellectual self-defense and the new, well-formed militia to stamp out the ugly head of tyranny. We were given the Second Amendment to protect the First, and as the nation was founded on Christian principles, it is truly an abomination to our Creator to be a willing slave to the 14th Amendment, and the egregore we all colloquially refer to as Satan, and could be more accurately referenced to as Saturn. But I'm going to put down the tinfoil and let your journey begin right there. And never forget to seek truth and honor their Creator above all, and let that be the whole of the law.
That's the important thing here, is that everyone's word should be meant for a use.
And the words that I'm using today are meant to pull down idols within people's temples.
Meaning that I want to destroy
falsities that they have idolized
for their entire life.
And just pull those out and sweep them clean. And before that temple,
and get reinfested with a new lie. Give it true life.